Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malde, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Centre. In this week's episode, BPC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal Brown and I chat with Jason Wendle, an expert in migration and labour mobility. We speak about various initiatives that Jason is involved in that facilitate migration from lower income to higher income countries by increasing the use of existing migration pathways. Such initiatives can benefit those on the move, the countries that welcome them, and the countries they often temporarily leave behind. With the absence of meaningful immigration reform legislation on the horizon, such efforts are a promising approach to simultaneously reduce poverty and help tackle workforce shortages. So stay tuned to hear more. With all the recent discussion of immigration as an issue or crisis, it's important to remember that migration can be a win-win. For migrants, moving to a new country can mean better job opportunities and the potential to escape poverty. For receiving countries, accepting migrants can help address workforce shortages and boost economic growth. And for the countries that migrants often temporarily leave, evidence shows a brain gain rather than a brain drain. In the absence of meaningful legal immigration reform that changes laws to boost immigration, one approach to making the most of these benefits is to help facilitate increased immigration through the pathways that already exist. This has been the focus of today's guest, Jason Wendle. Jason is an expert in migration and labour mobility and has spent over 20 years building initiatives in the social impact space. He founded an initiative called the Migration Opportunity to spread the idea that helping people move across borders for economic opportunity is one of the best possible uses of foreign aid or philanthropy to address global poverty. As a managing director at the Global Development Incubator, he works closely with some of the leading actors in this emerging field and is helping launch a new fund called the Talent Mobility Fund. Jason is a serial advisor and board member with a master's in public administration in international development from Harvard Kennedy School. So, with that bio out of the way, welcome to the podcast, Jason.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So, today we're going to focus on your work facilitating migration from lower income to higher income countries by increasing the use of existing migration pathways. So, firstly, what got you into this work?
So, as far back as grad school, I was thinking about migration as a potential solution to global poverty. My brother called me up while I was studying and said, like, have you figured out like the big silver bullet? And mostly what you learn in grad school is all the things that haven't worked. But I said, if we could really actually let people move across borders for jobs, it might make a big difference. But I wasn't able to really work on the issue for many years, despite I think I may be one of the only people who was a teaching assistant to both Lant Pritchett and George Borjas. Lant Pritchett being having written a book called Let Their People Come, and George Borjas, especially recently, being known for a bit more skeptical on immigration. But it was only really in about 2020 when I got back in touch with Lant Pritchett and Rebecca Smith from LAMP, who were coming out of the Center for Global Development with an idea to spread labor mobility as a solution worldwide to global poverty. And in my capacity at GDI, I came to help them incubate that first program or first initiative. And after doing that, we started to discover together that there is actually a lot of opportunity that's untapped in the space. And there's a lot of social entrepreneurs that are working on some of these issues, and yet there isn't really a big backing of philanthropy or aid for this type of work. And so I began to add other initiatives to my portfolio. Malengo is one that we may talk about in a bit, and the Talent Mobility Fund that you mentioned earlier. And the other thing that kind of pulled me into this, I guess, in parallel or motivationally, is I lived in Kenya for about 6 years working on international development in a number of different areas. And we had kind of the formal requirements of our work, whether it was to increase milk production in smallholder dairy cooperatives, or whether it was to try to work on rural electrification, et cetera. But when I would talk to people in a personal capacity outside of my work, the main thing they would ask me for is, can you help me get a job in the US? And really, when living in a developing country, trying to work on these issues, a lot of people are really just looking for like, hey, if you just let me do the work I'm doing now, but do it in your country, I'm going to get paid, I know, 10 times the amount that I'm currently getting paid. Can you help me make that happen? And of course, usually my answer, or in all those cases, and I'm saying like, I really wish I could, but I can't help you get a job in the U.S. But what we found now is that there actually are a lot of opportunities in OECD countries. We can talk a little bit about the U.S. being a bit of an exception to make some of those wishes possible. So that's kind of pulled me in, and it's been a really exciting ride for the past 4 years as the world has started to shift in some big ways.
Yeah. So, why do you see this particular work as important? You talked a little bit about sort of the limitations of the traditional development models that you're working in. Why do you think this is important, and who are the main beneficiaries from the work?
Yeah. So in the end, the main beneficiaries are the individuals who move. And I think sometimes it's hard for the current development paradigm to capture that because we measure things like GDP per capita, but we don't think about that means we think only about the people that are within a certain nation state's borders, as opposed to looking at like income per natural is a word that Pritchett used, but basically looking at the income gains to a people as opposed to a geographic space. And what you do find again and again is that individuals can get, as I said, 10 to 15 times income gains for the same level of education, the same type of jobs, just being in a different place where there's more productive institutions and economies that they can benefit from. However, it's not just those individuals that are benefiting, and I think if that was the case, it would be harder maybe to make the case. Although I think that's the center of our motivation. But when you look at sending countries that they've come from, they're benefiting from remittances. Now remittances are 3 times the amount of foreign aid that low and middle income countries received. They also are more than foreign direct investment that these countries received. But even beyond remittances, which play a really important role in resilience. So, for example, like when you deal with financial crises and financial shocks, countries that have access to foreign remittances are able to weather those. But even beyond that, there's a lot of interesting new insight or emerging insight about the role of migration in stimulating trade. So, the World Bank did a study that found that for every additional migrant from Africa, the country that they came from, their annual trade exports increased by $2,000 per year. So there's trade gains because you're making connections between countries. And then there's some interesting thoughts around how foreign direct investment, when led by a member of the diaspora, can be more effective than other foreign investment because diaspora members understand their home country better than the average foreign investor. So there's a lot of evidence to that type of benefit, and also there's some really interesting stories about the way that the Indian IT sector, for example, developed using migrants who had left India and come back. Or if you look at the Bangladeshi garment sector, many of the leading firms in the Bangladeshi garment sector were people that went to Korea and worked in the Korean garment sector and then returned back to Bangladesh. So a lot of benefits on the sending side. And then the receiving side, and I think this is what has really changed in the last few years, is that demographics have started to bite in countries that are aging. So places like Japan with a median age of 49, or Germany with a median age, I think, of 45, when you start to find that there simply are not enough workers to do the jobs that are needed in an economy, you'll see policy changes much more rapidly. And the Japan, people used to call it like a closed country. Every couple of years, they've made an increase in the target numbers they're trying to stimulate for immigration. And you'll also see loosening of restrictions, allowing family members to come sooner, many different changes, and it's spurred on by the need for workers. And we saw that, I think post pandemic in North America, the need for essential services and essential workers. And as that has shifted, it has created more policy space. The benefits are, you can think of it most clearly if you think about like who's going to take care of the elderly in these societies. Most people at present do not want a robot taking care of their grandmother, even if that such a robot did exist. And so what has changed is that the benefits to the receiving countries is now starting to be very, very clear.
So, Jason, you mentioned the benefits for the sending countries. You mentioned remittances. We do hear the claim that there is a negative impact from a so-called brain drain, where these countries lose talent. Would you say that that is misplaced and that it's a net benefit for the sending countries?
Yeah, so brain drain is a phrase that was coined to, I guess, a theoretical potential negative impact from migration. But again and again, as it's been studied empirically, people just can't find strong evidence for this supposed phenomena. You could, with some exceptions, so you could talk about like small island states losing doctors. You could imagine that you might find some challenges there. But when you look at most other, almost every other profession or occupation, you're going to see that, first of all, brain drain often assumes that the stock of skills in a country is fixed. That if you take a skilled person away from that country, there's just nothing they can do to replace it. First of all, when you have countries that have like a median age of 16, there is no shortage of young, energetic, and skillable people. But also, the other reason why that's kind of a fallacy is that when you do give people opportunity to have significant economic gains through earning a skill or learning a skill, they tend to invest in acquiring that skill. So there's a great study in the Philippines by Paulo Abarcar about how as Filipino workers were able to get jobs abroad in nursing, many more became credentialed in the Philippines. And then most recently, we're starting to see a repeat of that phenomena in Nigeria. Some recent work by CGD showed that the number of registered nurses or certified nurses in Nigeria went from like 3,000 to 12,000 in a few-year period. And of those, only 3,000 actually went to the UK. But the fact that the opportunity to go to the UK was there spurred that investment in becoming educated to be a nurse. So the fact that skills can be built and that they're not static is one major reason why we see brain gain. But another really big point to keep in mind, and I think for the work that we're doing, is that in the future, most of the jobs that are really going to be needed and where the shortages are in the trade and services sectors and places that don't require college degrees. So in the past, the conversation about brain drain has been concerned about taking like the doctors and scientists away from low and middle income countries. Most of the impact that we're seeking through the use of aid and philanthropy for migration is actually to help people move who work in the trade and services sector. Things like construction, plumbing, electricians, solar panel installation, heat pump installation, retail, hospitality, tourism, elderly care, as I've mentioned. All of these sectors are not classified as super high skilled sectors, and yet they actually meet the critical needs of the receiving economies. So, for those occupations, I don't even think that the brain drain conversation is probably relevant, but you do hear it come up. And then I think the last thing to note, even in the case of taking highly skilled, let's say scientists or tech workers, you find so many benefits, especially in a very globalized and tech enabled society. You find so many learnings and knowledge transfers going back to the sending countries. And often the people themselves will want to come back. They want to make a little bit of money and come back home. And when they do, they bring both knowledge and networks and capital with them back to sending countries.
That's all very fascinating. I just want to point out that the State Department is in the process of re-examining its so-called skills list for the J-1 exchange visitor program. And this was something that was designed decades and decades ago with the idea of trying to prevent brain drain, where it says if you come to the United States on a research visa or as a work visa, you have to go back to your country for at least 2 years before you can immigrate to the United States so as to try to prevent that brain drain. But what we're finding is that kind of, as you just said, that theory may or may not hold, that even if they can stay, they may still generate benefits back for their country. So I think that's very fascinating. But going back to something you started out, where you started out, poverty reduction, global development, how do these programs compare to sort of traditional approaches to international development, whether it's direct investment or cash transfers or these sort of aid programs that organizations like USAID and others try to do in developing countries? How does it compare to sort of those in terms of what we've seen in development?
Yeah. So, and the reason why I'm spending my time here and the reason why I'm saying this is possibly the single best use of philanthropy or aid is that it's orders of magnitude difference in terms of the potential impact that you can generate by enabling someone to cross a border for opportunity. So I'll give you some numbers and then I'll explain where these numbers come from. There's an organization called Malengo that I work with, and they've modeled the impact of their work at 50 times that of cash transfers. And then LAMP, who I've mentioned earlier, they've modeled a number of programs they're looking at. And the way they model is how many dollars of income gains can we produce for the migrants for every $1 of philanthropy. And the numbers they're getting are about $100 to $300 of income for every $1 of philanthropy. Now, the reason that these numbers are so large is because of two kind of factors that kind of multiply against each other. The first is that simply by crossing a border, you now can, the same, as I've mentioned a couple of times, the same work is now maybe worth 10 times what it used to be worth. So, or, even more, a taxi driver if you look at the home that a taxi driver in Nairobi lives in, and you look at the home that a taxi driver in the United States lives in, you're going to see that 10 to 20 times difference in terms of income and wealth. But the second factor is that in the long term and really starting out in the medium term, philanthropy can really transfer to private sector uptake of mobility and migration. In the long term, migration and mobility can be handled by the private sector with no philanthropy or aid whatsoever, because there's so much value being created for employers and for workers and for the various stakeholders that it is in the interest of all of the parties to be part of these markets. They just haven't gotten off the ground because there's a lot of transaction costs, frictions, and market failures in the early days that need to be overcome. But the way that you get $100 to $300 of impact for every $1 of philanthropy is through the assumption that after you first maybe subsidize movement or subsidize, for example, language training or skilling, in the long term, the private sector or individuals are able to cover those costs, and eventually the markets is taking over. And so that initial investment that you're making is getting multiples through the markets carrying it forward.
And Jason, how do you think the work you do compares to efforts to actually change immigration policies and laws in destination countries? So, in the United States, we haven't seen meaningful immigration reform for decades. So, do you think it's still worth pushing for this reform?
So, firstly, I think that there's an important element of demonstration to create any type of policy change. And so one of the reasons why we are working in places where there are policies already in place, for example, different parts of Europe, even the UK, Germany, Japan, I've mentioned these, but Korea has policies in place. Even Italy right now actually has tripled the number of work permits that it's issuing for, or work visas that it's issuing for foreign workers. The reason why we're working in these areas is that we do want to show what's possible, and then we believe that once you can show progress, that can be that can actually precede policy change, because you'll now have some examples to point to. So we haven't given up. This emerging field that I'm trying to work with hasn't given up on policy change. That said, when I do talk to people in the U.S., it seems like almost everyone I talk to is very pessimistic about the prospects of legislative reform, and I keep every once in a while I'll talk to someone new who might have a different insight, and I hope they're gonna give me a more positive response. I haven't found it yet, but I think that if you would have said, I don't know, if you had said 5 years ago in Japan that Japan would change its temporary internship, temporary intern training program, which was meant for people to come and then leave, to a program that was actually meant to now feed into long-term stays, and that within 5 years after being a specified skilled worker, which is another program they've built, then they would change the program again so that people could bring their families to move permanently to Japan. I think most people would say like this kind of change will never happen. And I think what the difference is that when you start to really feel the pinch of demographic change, it does change the way people think about policy. So I've done some work in North Dakota where they've had significant challenges keeping up with the number of jobs being created. And I've found, all of the employers I've spoken to in North Dakota are 100% behind finding ways to get more people to come to the U.S. For the types of jobs that they're in. So there are some seeds of hope. I think that the challenge is some of the way that our overall political system works in the US. And I think one other challenge is because there has been so much illegal immigration and we haven't really enforced some of the laws around that, we haven't realized how bad our demographics are. I think that what you're seeing is a lot of irregular migration that's filling the hole that employers would otherwise be having to face more directly, and therefore we haven't built the coalitions needed to say let's change the immigration laws now, which is unfortunately sort of like a perverse result of illegal immigrants are coming and they're filling critical jobs in our economy, but because they're doing it under the table, there's no pressure. There's not the necessary pressure that we would need on the part of employers to change the laws.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I mean, polling that VPC has done has shown that the greatest area of bipartisan support for reforming immigration is around changing our legal immigration system, particularly for economic benefit, workforce, and skilled immigration.
Yeah.
So that's an area of agreement. But I think, as you're right, it's up against a lot of headwinds for a lot of people who aren't necessarily personally or seeing or feeling that pinch. The other thing I can imagine that you might get in terms of pushback or critiques from this work is that you're saying that, immigrants are going to come in and fill these jobs. There's always this conversation in the United States, at least, and I'm sure it's happening in some other places of the world as we see some of the political things that are happening in Europe, for example, that, what about our citizens, right? Shouldn't we be taking care of them first before we sort of import more people to do these jobs? Or there's enough people? You mentioned sort of the overall demographics, but what other pushback or critiques have you sort of heard from partners in this work? Are there concerns that in either sending or receiving countries that you constantly have to kind of address?
Yeah, so we do have to address concerns about pushback or backlash. If you're successful, will there be a backlash? I think firstly, we haven't seen it so much from the point of view of like, is this competing with domestic workers? And that's partially because I think, like, for example, the United States right now has like 9 million unfilled jobs, and it's apparently costing us about $500 billion a year. It's hard to make the case that in the current especially in the current low unemployment environment, that there's a direct competition, and more evidence keeps coming out, that when you bring in workers, it actually even creates more local employment. But where we hear more backlash is one, are you going to have like cultural, or will people fit culturally with the countries that they're coming into? And if there was too large of a group migrating, would you start to have like a cultural backlash? And then I think the other question we hear is if people are already up in arms, and if you look at like we could call them like populist movements that appear to be very anti-immigration, whether it's in the U.S. or in Europe, how you're going to be kind of causing more of a problem or facing even a bigger headwind. I think my take on this, and some of the things we'll only learn once we get to a larger scale. But if you look at political sentiment, one thing that people don't like in general is feeling like laws are being ignored or feeling like the rules are being broken. And what we're trying to do is create systems where people are following the rules and they're coming for the pathway they said they're coming for. They're not using one pathway, but actually doing something different. And they're getting a job before they arrive. And I think that's actually a big difference is, do you have a job before you come, or are you coming and then looking for a job? And our hypothesis is that if people are coming because already an employer on the ground has said, we need this person to fill this role, that the perception of like, what is a migrant in our economy starts to change. It's people that come to fill jobs that we've already determined that we need them to fill. And I think there's some good evidence for that. If you look at the H-2A system in the US, which is primarily operating in rural areas, which is where you might think there could be like resistance to migration. You generally don't see resistance to the H-2A system, and you often hear really interesting stories about farm communities and the workers who come from Mexico. I hear stories about farmers going to Mexico to go to the wedding of someone who worked for them on the farm, and like you see some really interesting bonds being formed and changes in perceptions. So I do think that and again, you can think about Europe. When people think of a migrant as someone who just crossed into their border and is claiming asylum, that's a different kind of mental picture than someone who they hired and they brought in and integrated, kind of in advance. And so we hope that we can change the narrative that way. The other thing that I often want to point out is one way or another, these demographic forces and these economic forces are so strong that we will not be able to stop migration in any case. Because as long as there are places that just have these massive labor shortages and places where people are earning less than $2 a day, and as long as it's possible to cross the Mediterranean on a boat or to walk across the desert, people are going to try to do that. And so if we work now to set up systems that are law-abiding, well-managed, that serve employers' needs, it's going to result in a much better overall support than the alternative, which won't be no migration. It's just going to be a lot more chaotic and irregular migration.
Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll talk about some of the specific initiatives that Jason's working on. So stay tuned.
So welcome back. We're speaking with Jason Wendle about various initiatives that he's working on to increase mobility across borders for development. So Jason, you've mentioned a couple of these programs, so let's dive in a little bit to the things that you're working on. Let's start with your work for the Labor Mobility Partnerships, or LAMP. Can you tell us what LAMP does and what you do in your role as a strategic advisor for LAMP?
Sure, yeah. So LAMP is set up to facilitate or demonstrate what good labor mobility looks like around the world. And so, or you could call it occupational mobility, basically moving across borders for work. LAMP is very specifically focused on non-degreed holders in its programming, and it tends to be focused on labor mobility as opposed to the movement of displaced people. LAMP works to solve problems in existing systems, and based on those solutions that are developed, to replicate those solutions across at a larger scale within those systems, but also across other migration corridors. So LAMP, it's probably best to kind of give an example. We found that it was hard to show people what we mean when we say, we need more labor mobility globally. When we go to a country and work alongside of the employers, the recruiters, the on the destination side and on the sending side, the trainers, the sending side recruiters, the government, the policy, and establish programs that show, okay, it's actually possible to move people from this country to that country for this type of job. It creates momentum around these ideas, and then it gives us something concrete to point to and say, this is what we mean when we say good labor mobility. My role there has been as a strategic advisor, but really it's trying to, how do you take this concept of increasing labor mobility for poverty reduction, and how do you turn that into concrete demonstrations of what we really mean, and then how do you build an organization that can do that and can be sort of a thought leader globally, and can transition from this early demonstration work that I'm describing to larger systems change. In the long term, LAMP doesn't want to be on the ground setting up each individual labor mobility partnership. What they want to be doing is helping to advise the governments and the industry associations that are needed to make these systems work on the best way to establish labor mobility in a country. And one kind of key thing to add in terms of what LAMP's role is that they're working on multipliers, i.e. solutions like finance or technology that if you can get it right in one corridor, it can actually work globally. So an example of that is finance for language learning. Again and again, we find that a barrier to people taking advantage of existing labor mobility pathways is the ability to learn a language, which may be required to get a visa. And there's a lot of reasons why people can benefit from learning that language, but why they wouldn't spend the money and the time up front to learn the language, because typically you don't have a job offer, a year before you learn a new language. And so what LAMP is coming in and doing is developing new types of micro lending or income share agreement models to enable people to finance language learning, and then to take the risk to help cover some of the risk of these models, the risk of learning a language or the risk of hiring someone before you have them. Those kind of like frictions, LAMP's trying to solve through financial solutions, and then encourage uptake by financial institutions that can do that.
So, which countries does LAMP focus on, and why? I guess in terms of both the sending and receiving countries.
Sure. Yeah. So LAMP has been all over the world. So, for example, ranging from working with DFAT in Australia to figure out how how do we help Papua New Guinea take better advantage of its seasonal, what's called the Pacific labor mobility scheme, to South America, Colombia to Spain. There's an a program to train elderly care workers in Colombia to work in Spain. I think that where LAMP will increasingly want to focus is in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where most of the population growth is over the next 20, 30 years. Pretty soon, like all of the population growth in the world is going to be coming from these regions. And that's where the greatest need is going to be for opportunities across borders. Because, for example, in Africa, every year 12 million youth are added to the labor force, but only 3 million new formal jobs are created. So LAMP has a small office in Kenya and has been doing a number of partnerships there because the government of Kenya has been very pro labor mobility and is trying to set up partnerships in Japan and Germany and the UK. And LAMP is doing a little bit of work between Ghana and Germany right now, and then some really interesting work in India, starting with a language learning solution for India to Germany, but increasingly other opportunities for India to be a real leader in the space. And lastly, they are doing a lot in between. Their very first work was between Mexico and the US for the H2A model, and trying to show that you can improve the quality of recruitment and address challenges of abuse in labor mobility systems. So over time, I think initially LAMP's goal was like, let's work wherever we can to show progress. But over time, we'll start to hone in more on what are the key regions where the greatest population growth is. And then how can we also play like a global role coordinating a good or a responsible labor mobility industry.
So what are some of the main challenges to that work?
Yeah, so the biggest challenge, and one of the reasons why I have started to shift from so I used to work really, my plurality of my work in this space was with LAMP. I've started to shift away from that because one of the challenges that we've had is there's just not a category of funding associated with migration for good or migration for impact, or what I sometimes call cross-border livelihoods. And so LAMP now has just a really impressive list of potential opportunities to show movement on labor mobility or to fix systems, and just it's constantly an uphill climb to find funding to test these things out. And so I have begun to pivot to the migration opportunity, which is an initiative to kind of bring more funders and more aid agencies into the space, and to say, like, really, migration needs to be up there with climate, health, education, in terms of major funding priorities. And we need to look, if we're going to do livelihood work, which is the focus, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, given the needs of youth employment of many funders' work, we have to also look at the demand across borders. We can't just look at local demand. So that's one. But I think the others is, and this is a common across this work, is it's a very long timeline to go from conceptualizing what could be done out of labor mobility to really getting to scale. And there's been a lot of small pilot programs around the world that haven't reached a lot of scale. And there's a number of reasons for that. Sometimes it's the way they were initially conceived. Sometimes it's that the funding cycles are in 3-year cycles. But what you really need is a long runway that starts with early demonstration. Then you start to bring in early kind of, let's say, diagnosing the problems. Then you start to subsidize an early solution to the problem. But then you have to simultaneously build the larger infrastructure and bring in, let's say, impact investment money, and then eventually getting the private sector to take over. And it could take a decade to get to the real big numbers that we think are needed. And so that's a challenge because you need patient partners along the way.
So you're also involved with an organization called Malengo, which you mentioned. Malengo focuses on enabling international educational migration. Can you tell us a bit more about what Malengo does and also what your role is?
So Malengo is a really interesting organization in that they found an opportunity to start moving people right away if they could use the student visa pathway into Europe. And they also noted that the cost of doing so was not that high because college in Europe tends to be either highly subsidized or just very low cost relative to what we're used to in the US. So initially, starting between Uganda and Germany, Malengo created an income share agreement financial product where they will provide upfront to students from Uganda 1 year of living expenses, which is what you need to get a student visa in Uganda, plus some additional support. And there's like mentoring throughout the program. And in return, when that student graduates, they will pay a small percentage of their income back to Malengo to cover that upfront investment and to pay returns to the investors, or to pay it back to Malengo, who then pays it forward to future students. And they have already sent about 250 students. The last 100 of that, I think, is going to be sent pretty soon. But they've already initiated income share agreements with 250 students, and they're demonstrating something that I don't think anyone really thought was possible. These are not students who typically, like students from Africa who go to university abroad, tend to be from wealthy backgrounds. The average household per capita income of a Malengo scholar is $1.40 a day. So we're talking about high school graduates, promising high school graduates, but not wealthy in any way. And because of this income share agreement, they're now able to have transformative opportunities. So the assumption is that most of them will graduate, stay in Germany or Europe, and work with starting salaries at, for example, 40,000 euros a year. These students are sending back remittances that average 2,200% or 22 times what their household incomes were prior to this program. So it's really interesting. There's a randomized, the person who started it, his name is Johannes Haushofer, and he's a professor, and he is actually known for conducting the randomized control trial of Give Directly. And he's conducting now a randomized control trial on the Malengo model. And I think so something else that's really exciting about it is it's going to produce some really good evidence of what is the impact of migration opportunities for individuals, but also for their households. So he's looking at, if people think that they can get access to a university placement in Germany, will high schools or high school students invest more in their education? So yeah, it's very exciting. And I think for Malengo, Uganda, Germany was where we started, because that's where it was a natural fit. But the idea is really all of Africa to all of Europe.
So last but not least, the most recent initiative that you're involved with is this new Talent Mobility Fund. Can you tell us what it is? And this one definitely does have at least partially a U.S. nexus too. So tell us
That's
about
right.
that.
Yeah, so the Talent Mobility Fund is a new fund designed to make grants for innovative projects that can help people move across existing legal pathways for mobility. And it has both a US STEM track and a global mobility track. The US STEM track is focused on high-skilled, talented students students or individuals who are going to go to the US through existing channels like the O1 visa, the J1 visa, and pathways that have kind of started to emerge lately. That track is led by Amy Nice, who is one of the world's or the US's biggest experts in this particular type of migration. And she is helping to she's identified some of the partners out there that can do this type of work. For example, educating universities about how they could help their foreign students prepare for O1 visa applications. So that's the STEM side. My side of the Talent Mobility Fund is called the Global Mobility Track. And this is essentially funding for new social entrepreneurs that have a vision to try to move people across pathways that are already in effect, that don't require legislative change, essentially. And the Malengo, for example, 5 years ago when they were just getting started, that would be the kind of thing that we would make a grant to from the Global Mobility Track, where it's like, okay, I have a new idea. I think we can use this visa pathway. I think I can, solve this particular problem, this bottleneck. And so we'll make grants. You can imagine small $100,000 grants for testing an idea or developing an idea, and then maybe $500,000 grants for piloting. Now, the global mobility side of the fund is we're still raising funding to build that fund, whereas the STEM side is already up and running, and they're starting to make their first grants. This was initially something that came to Amy and me from Schmidt Futures. Amy and I had both been separately talking about some of the things that we thought needed to happen. And a team from Schmidt Futures was like, hey, you should really set up a fund. And now the Schmidt Futures team behind the fund is called Renaissance Philanthropy. They've recently set up an organization called Renaissance Philanthropy, and we've been partnering together, and I'm hoping to raise the rest of the fund in the next year and be able to start making grants. In the meantime, I keep finding really interesting. Sometimes it's like one individual who's figured out how to send construction workers to Japan from Bangladesh, or somebody who is helping train green skill workers from India in Germany. But they're typically small teams with not a lot of capital. So we'd love to find those individuals and give them a little bit of grants to get started.
This sounds like solving the problem that you mentioned earlier with LAMP, right? Having good ideas, but not enough funding. So now you're generating the funding capacity to do that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
And it's interesting though that you're looking at two different. You have the high skilled sort of STEM track for the U.S. and sort of maybe the more generalized mobility track. Is it fair to say that the STEM track, it's U.S. focused, but I guess it could be used similarly in other countries? Is that focused on higher income countries, and the global mobility track is more on poverty reduction, or do you see kind of these things can go either way?
Yeah, so I think, yes, on the US STEM side, when we're making the impact case, a lot of it does also look at the role that technology and innovation gain, the value that the US gets and the world gets from bringing someone from another country into the best ecosystem for innovation in the world. And then you get all these benefits in terms of technology and innovation gains. Whereas on the global mobility side, it's the type of impact I've been talking about, which is large scale impact income gains for a large number of people. However, both concepts still apply. So on the global mobility side, as I've already said, these occupations that are not quote unquote high skilled are still making really important contributions to destination side economies. You could think about, for example, how labor force participation of highly educated women in the US might be affected by worker shortages in the care economy, which is something that a lot of people are looking at right now. So if you don't have elderly care workers, if you don't have retail workers, et cetera, it's harder for people to enter the workforce in these higher skill professions. So that's an important complement. And then on the STEM side, of course, I've already talked a little bit about how sending countries can benefit when they're sending people. But it'll, in addition to the technology and innovation gains, we think there's also going to be those poverty reduction effects through remittances, trade, and things like that.
So we touched on this a bit earlier, but there can be political challenges to increasing migration to higher income countries. For example, concerns about domestic worker competition. Do you find that you encounter these challenges, and does it guide which countries you actually focus on? So you mentioned Germany, for example. Do you choose Germany because it's just a bit more tractable? There's less pushback.
Yeah. So one of the things we want is wherever there are pathways that we could use, we want to demonstrate that it's possible to do them successfully. So I've talked about how the US, for example, has a little bit more difficult legal environment because there are very few pathways for workers who don't have college degrees. But even still, LAMP is doing a really interesting project to enable workers from Central America to get C1D visas and work in the United States cruise industry, in the Florida Caribbean cruise industry. Germany, the reason why I do talk about Germany so much is that in the last 2 years, they have made a number of reforms to make it easier for someone to come to Germany and get a job. So they've extended the time for job search visas. They have written in various ways that the visa authorities could recognize qualifications from the sending country for jobs that are not college degree jobs. There's an apprenticeship pathway, etc. And so to some degree, there's like a strike while the iron's hot approach, because again, I think that if we're not able to move people through these pathways, people might say, look, we tried this. We try to make it possible. It's just not possible. There just isn't the demand. And really, that's not the case. It's just that there are a lot of barriers to these labor mobility pathways becoming a reality. And so we need to solve some of the, skills matching is a classic challenge of like, how do you convince an employer in Germany that the training they've done as an electrician in India will work when they come to Germany. So there's a lot of like problems to solve. We want to solve those problems in countries like Germany that have made the pathways clear, because we think that'll give us a chance to then talk to other countries about what's possible. Yeah, there are some countries where you have like active work to kind of gum up the work. So sometimes you'll have a situation where on paper there is a legal pathway, but the visa processing is being sort of deliberately slowed down to prevent people from coming, and that would create a real barrier. So we do try to like flag and avoid those in the short term, at least until those issues can be addressed. I'll say that so far I haven't seen a lot of work in francophone countries, but LAMP is doing some interesting work to attempt to enable healthcare workers to go from Senegal to France. I would like to see more in francophone countries. But yeah, I would say that we don't necessarily see in the short term political barriers slowing us down, because initially we're starting also kind of behind the scenes with what looks like initially small flows of workers. And there's a lot of problems to solve there. But when there is government support, it really can create a little bit of a catalyst. So, for example, I was in Japan earlier this year, and I met with the Department of Immigration Services, which is responsible for all immigration to Japan. And they said, we want to become the destination or a premium destination for talent in the world. We realize we have to have more workers, and we want to be a premium destination. And they asked us, like, what do you think we could do to better market our immigration pathways to other workers? And so when you have that kind of support from a government, it does open doors, because now, for example, we can talk to JICA, the Japanese aid agency, and say, there's an opportunity for you to invest in something that's aligned with the needs of the country as a whole. And so that's like one less hurdle that you have to overcome. So that is important. And maybe lastly, I will add a couple things about aid agencies. USAID, I think, has a really interesting role to play in fostering labor mobility that can address poverty in the places that it works. And I've seen a lot of willingness and support on the USAID team to try to explore this. There's already some interesting projects. So the cruise project that I mentioned with LAMP, that's USAID is helping to fund that with IOM. And so we're really excited about what that could be. But I think that you could think globally about the ways in which USAID could help demonstrate these types of solutions to poverty. And one area that is really needed is skilling on the sending side. And this is a thing that aid agencies have often spent a lot of money on. So technical and vocational educational training programs, or TVET programs, is a thing that aid agencies have put a lot of investment into, but sometimes they haven't been oriented around the demands of employers. So if you take that kind of classic model of investing in skilling, but you tailor it towards what do employers in Europe need from these skills, you can actually use aid in a way that unlocks the type of movement that we think is possible and can be really transformative.
So the Migration Policy Institute recently issued a report looking at some of these labor mobility, skilled mobility programs, and finds that employment and skills-based mobility projects have encountered challenges in fully realizing their potential or anticipated benefits. And some of these are some of the challenges you already talked about: building up project infrastructure, private sector investment, the long lead times, and scalability. Do you agree with some of their findings? And what do you think are the best approaches for trying to tackle those, so that these kinds of partnerships can really kind of be seen as a key part of international development and investment programs?
Yeah, I do agree with some of the diagnoses that they made. So, for example, one of the things that the report highlights is that the programs that some of these global skills partnership programs they were looking at have been funded on 3-year funding cycles. And so the funding cycle itself doesn't actually give enough time to build the solutions that need to be built. I think one of the important things they highlight is that employer needs haven't often been met by these programs. So the employers have been skeptical about the skills of the workers that these programs are providing. Now, where I would distinguish the work that LAMP and the field that I'm working with is trying to get off the ground from some of the early skills partnership models that they're evaluating is that a lot of these programs have been government to government programs, or G to G. And really what that means is they become entirely self-enclosed systems where the government or the funded implementer with the aid funding does all of the sourcing of workers, the training of workers, the recruiting of workers, the handover, and tries to really run it as a program, as opposed to taking an industry building approach where it's like, okay, what do we need to do to address the bottlenecks? But how do we let the private sector, which is ultimately the only way that mobility is going to come to scale is through private sector investment. How do we let them take on the things that they're really good at doing? And one thing that we found globally is the government is not good at finding the right workers that have the right skills for employers, and employers tend not to trust government to give them the workers they need. And as long as it's that kind of an entity that's doing this work, it's really hard to match the employer needs. What you need is to focus on what are the things that the public sector does well. So effectively regulating recruitment agencies, or subsidizing things that I do think are public goods. Like, I think language learning should be considered a public good because it has all these spillovers for both sending and receiving societies, and because people don't invest in language learning on their own without the job kind of already built in. So you could be investing in those types of bottlenecks, language learning. You could think about large scale education campaigns to help employers understand like what their opportunities are in terms of sourcing from sending countries. But when it comes to actually recruiting workers and delivering them to destination countries, that needs to ultimately be a private sector function. I was at the office of one of these programs in a sending country, and I was talking to them. They were trying to send nurses to a country in Europe, and they were complaining that private sector recruiters were sending nurses instead of them, and so they weren't able to hit their targets, when in fact they should have been celebrating the fact that they were getting competed with by the private sector, because that means they were actually doing their job, which is creating a market that can work on its own. And so the change that needs to happen is not to think in terms of 3-year self-enclosed aid-funded programs that they start and they finish, and afterwards they've done their work, but they don't have a bridge to a longer term scale up. But rather to think in terms of like, okay, we're doing this over, let's say, a decade kind of time horizon. Maybe we only have a 3-year grant period initially. So what should we invest in the first 3 years to help unlock the bottlenecks that are preventing the markets from working? And then, okay, we have to get another grant 3 years later. It's not about like, did we deliver X number of workers in this period of time, but it's more, how are we partnering with the private sector leaders and firms that need to start doing this? How do we bring more investment and capital to the table, et cetera? And how do we not crowd out? Like, there's a number of occasions where private recruiters have actually left an entire market because they can't compete with fully subsidized programs like some of these pilot programs. So there is that's something that going back to the question of like challenges we face, I think that I have found in Europe, people that have experienced these pilots have sometimes get pessimistic because they're like, oh, like what more can you do? And so I think that when I talk about the need for philanthropy and aid in the space, it doesn't mean to create programs that are meant to be like all in one sort of like standalone programs to deliver workers from one place to another. What it means is to spark innovation and to address kind of the big infrastructural needs in these systems. One other kind of big piece of infrastructure that you could imagine being good for aid or philanthropy is like technology platforms or technology tools. There's many people that attempt to create job matching apps, but a lot of times there's a lot of reinventing of the wheel. You could imagine open source, what's called digital public infrastructure, which is typologies and tools and standards that every technology developer can use to help translate, for example, informal skills into what an employer is actually going to want to understand to determine if there's a skills match for their workers. So, technology for skill matching, public good investment in language learning, startup funding for early startups of social entrepreneurs. Those are the kinds of things that I think can help get the market moving. And then certainly effective regulation and management of recruitment industries. One of the big threats to labor mobility is when abuses occur. And I think that so much of, some of the biggest labor mobility stories in the world, 10 years ago were very much people going to the Gulf, and a lot of really unhealthy and abusive situations resulting from illicit recruitment practices and all of these kinds of things. And so establishing regulation and monitoring and supporting the responsible practices in the industry is a really important role for public investment, because when you have abuse in a system, it really turns off all the stakeholders to the potential of that system. And I think that's something, by the way, that Japan has really learned. Is early on they had a lot of bad stuff happening and bad stories coming out about the technical intern training program, and they've really invested in cleaning that up and in protecting the rights of the workers, because they realize, like, this is going to make it hard for us to attract labor if people think that workers are not going to be treated well when they come here.
Well, Jason, I just want to give you a chance. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our listeners about your work?
We're excited about what's possible. We think that if we can get some early investment now, and if we can, again, for one of the big things that's kind of urgently on mine is if I can bring in some early philanthropists, early believers in what's possible, and we can make investments now, then 5 years, 10 years down the road, we will have built systems that can manage migration in a way that's going to deliver a lot of benefits for all of our societies. And if we don't make these investments today, you're not going to see like a reduction in the chaotic, irregular migration stories that we see on the news all the time. And so in essence, like where everyone, I guess, on all sides of the political spectrum should probably try to organize around together, is that we don't want people to have to move across borders without any legal protection, and doing so, going through the Darien Gap or crossing the Mediterranean Sea on a dinghy. We need these people. They need livelihoods, and we can make this work in a way that's good for all of us, and is well managed, and can deliver really mutually beneficial solutions. So I think it's possible. I just need a bigger movement to emerge to kind of support the great work of people like LAMP and Malengo and many of the other organizations I've found over these past couple of years.
Well, great. I think we'll leave it there. But Jason, thanks so much for joining us. And we'll include some links to your various programs in our show notes so people can learn more about them. So yeah, good luck in your ongoing work to enable migration as a path for international development.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It's great to talk to you.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find our podcast episodes on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown, and you can follow me at Jack Malde. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malde. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.